Welcome, brave souls, to Ms. Nightmare Official. Tonight, we invite you into a realm where shadows whisper secrets, and every creak of the floorboards sends chills down your spine. If you think you can handle the terror that lurks in the dark, you're in the right place. These tales explore our darkest fears in a world filled with the unknown. So grab your flashlight, lock your doors, and let's begin. It was Christmas Eve, and the air felt heavy, as though the house itself held its breath. Sarah, a curious 12-year-old, lay in bed, her heart racing with anticipation for Christmas morning. The old house she called home creaked and groaned as the wind whistled outside, adding a layer of eerie melody to the festive night. Unable to resist the magnetic pull of the gifts under the tree, Sarah slipped out of bed. The wooden floorboards seemed louder than usual as she tiptoed down the hall. The glow of the Christmas tree illuminated the end of the hallway, casting playful shadows on the walls. But something felt wrong. The tree stood in its usual glory, adorned with twinkling ornaments and a star that seemed to pierce the darkness. Yet, as Sarah peeked around the corner, her eyes fixed on a figure by the tree. At first, she thought it was her younger brother. The figure was small, its posture hunched as though inspecting the neatly wrapped gifts. But its movements, jerky and disjointed, froze Sarah in place. Her pulse quickened. In the dim light, she could make out a long red candy cane in the figure's hand, but it wasn't the cheerful kind. It gleamed in a way that reminded her of a knife. She leaned closer, her curiosity mingling with terror. The figure tilted its head, and Sarah's breath caught as it turned toward her. Its face, or lack thereof, was a blank canvas, smooth as glass. No eyes, no mouth, just emptiness. Sarah gasped. The faceless figure snapped its head toward her, its candy cane blade glinting ominously. The room seemed to grow colder. The figure took a step toward her, and she tried to scream, but no sound came out. The lights on the tree flickered wildly, as though sensing the malevolence in the air. And then, in an instant, the figure disappeared. Sarah stumbled backward, her knees trembling as she ran back to her room and bolted the door. She didn't sleep that night. The vision of the faceless figure etched into her mind. The next morning, sunlight spilled into the house, erasing the terror of the night before, or so it seemed. Sarah recounted the horrifying encounter to her parents, but they dismissed it as a vivid nightmare fueled by too much excitement. But when the presents were unwrapped, Sarah's hands trembled as she opened one marked with her name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. The note, written in elegant cursive, read, "I'll be back next year." The joy of Christmas morning dissolved into an icy fear. Sarah's parents laughed it off as a cruel prank, but Sarah knew better. She avoided the tree that year, her eyes darting to the shadows with every creak and groan of the old house. The days turned to months, and as December approached, Sarah began to dread the holiday she had once cherished. For she knew, somewhere in the darkness, the faceless figure waited, counting down to Christmas Eve. It was the week before Christmas, when Ethan and his younger sister, Mia, decided to tackle some last-minute holiday shopping. The mall was alive with holiday cheer, every corner brimming with laughter and celebration. Yet, beneath this festive facade, a dark presence stirred. At first, Ethan noticed the man only in passing, a figure dressed in a long, dark coat, his face hard to make out. He seemed like any other shopper, until Ethan realized the man wasn't looking at the items on the shelves. He was looking at them. Ethan tried to shake it off, telling himself it was just a coincidence. But with every store they visited, the man was there, always lingering, always watching. A cold shiver crept up Ethan's spine as the man's presence became impossible to ignore. "Can I help you?" Ethan's voice was firm, though his heart pounded in his chest. The man didn't respond at first. He just smiled, a twisted, chilling grin that sent a wave of unease crashing over Ethan. "Merry Christmas," the man said softly, his voice dripping with something that felt far from festive. Ethan didn't wait for another word. Grabbing Mia, he pulled her toward the mall's exit. His instincts screamed at him to get out, to put as much distance as possible between them and the stranger. Relief washed over them as they neared the car. But then, standing near the mall doors, the man appeared again. This time he held something, a small, neatly wrapped gift box. "You forgot this," the man said, extending the box toward Ethan. Panic set in as Ethan unlocked the car. The man's footsteps grew louder, his pace quickening. The siblings barely had time to jump in and lock the doors before the man reached them. "Open the box! Open it!" Ethan hit the gas, tires screeching as the car sped away. In the rearview mirror, the man stood in the parking lot, his figure growing smaller until it was swallowed by the darkness. For a moment, it felt like the nightmare was over. But then Ethan realized something that sent a chill down his spine. The box. He didn't remember taking it, but there it was, sitting on the table. Against his better judgment, Ethan tore away the wrapping. Inside lay an ornament, small yet horrifying. Engraved at the base of the figure were words that would haunt Ethan forever. "See you next Christmas." It was a cold, quiet winter night, the kind that fills the air with an uneasy stillness. Melissa wasn't particularly superstitious, but even she felt the weight of something unsettling as she stepped out into the frosty parking lot. Snowflakes danced lazily around her, muffling the world into an eerie silence. She thought nothing of it at first. After all, what could go wrong on a simple late-night shopping trip? But as she crossed the road, her instincts began to whisper, softly at first, then louder, insistent. And there he was, just standing there. His figure barely illuminated by the streetlight, his pale face a stark contrast to the darkness of his coat. He didn't look at her like a passerby might glance at a stranger. No, his gaze bore into her, sharp and deliberate, as though he'd been waiting for her. Melissa felt the first prickle of fear, but she dismissed it. She told herself not to be ridiculous. What harm could a stranger do? But even as she rationalized, her footsteps quickened, unconsciously, instinctively. The man called out, his voice slicing through the still air. "Excuse me," he said, his tone calm, almost disarming. But Melissa felt no comfort. The words clung to her skin, cold and unnatural. Every step she took felt heavier, her shopping bag swinging awkwardly by her side. She tried to focus on the glow of her car just ahead, willing herself to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at her. The distance to her car seemed to stretch, the walk suddenly endless. Behind her, the crunch of footsteps followed hers, steady, intentional. Melissa tightened her grip on the keys, her pulse racing. She didn't dare look back, not yet. The man's tone shifted, his voice tinged with desperation now. "Please, don't leave me out here," he begged. But something in the way he said it made her stomach turn. His words weren't a plea, they were a command. Melissa's breathing quickened as she reached her car, her hands trembling as she struggled to unlock the door. She could feel him closing the gap. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. Then, he was there, standing right beside her window, his grin wide and grotesque. It wasn't just a smile, it was something primal, a mockery of human expression. And those eyes, they glowed faintly in the dark, like embers of a fire that refused to die. Melissa's breath caught in her throat as she started the engine. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just stood there, his face inches from hers, watching, waiting. As the car sped away, the world outside blurred into streaks of white and black. But Melissa couldn't shake the feeling that the man's eyes were still on her, that his grin lingered in the shadows. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she glanced into the rear-view mirror. Nothing. The road behind her was empty, but her unease remained. That night, sleep eluded her. The memory of the man, his voice, his grin, played over and over in her mind like a haunting melody she couldn't escape. Every creak of the house, every shadow cast by the moonlight, felt like his presence, creeping closer. 2 days later, Melissa thought she'd started to move on. She had almost convinced herself it was nothing, just a figment of her imagination born from exhaustion. But then came the package. No return address, no markings, just her name scrawled on the front in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. Her hands shook as she opened it, her unease bubbling back to the surface. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a photograph. It took her a moment to process what she was seeing. The image was of her, captured in the parking lot that night. There she was, standing by her car, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the streetlight. And just behind her, barely visible in the shadows, stood the man. His grin was even wider in the photo, his glowing eyes piercing through the paper. Melissa's stomach churned. She dropped the photo, her breath hitching as a single thought echoed in her mind. He was closer than I thought.